Okay, well I think this might be quite an interesting video, but it might be one of those ones that you have to watch a few minutes before it gets to the interesting part, because what I want to talk about is deism and some of the interesting questions that can arise. But I don't just want to look at kind of traditional deism, and traditional deism which of course is soaked really in Christianity, because although it eschews many of the trappings of Christianity, the idea of an immanent personal God, the idea of revelation, the idea of scripture and all that kind of malarkey and all those kind of very parochial, very human tales that have all the trappings of the naked apes that have made them up, it keeps some of the trappings. It's soaked in that kind of Abrahamic monotheism because that's the environment that it was born in and of, because that's the environment that all the philosophers and all the thinkers existed in. So some of those trappings, the omnipotence, the omniscience, the transcendental nature, all that kind of crap, the idea that the deity itself is the ultimate agent, the ultimate entity, all these kind of things bear all the hallmarks of Abrahamic monotheism. But of course there are many ideas that go well beyond that. Traditionally there have been the idea of kind of Cartesian demons simulating worlds within our brain, which are then kind of expanded in films like The Matrix, aren't they, where there is a real manifest, tangible world there with flesh and blood organisms existing, but they're experiencing a universe apart from that, a universe other than that. But I want to go beyond that as well, to perhaps ideas that didn't exist centuries ago, and in some cases perhaps couldn't exist centuries ago. One of the great things, the advent of the computer, is that it's allowed us to understand concepts that perhaps would have been very difficult to even envisage a century ago. And so that's where the simulation, Nick Bostrom's simulation argument, comes into this. I made a video on that about 2.5 years ago, and that's probably a video that's worth remaking, but rather than doing that, let's subsume this into here, because let's set that alongside another idea, which is an idea I've seen Brian Greene expound on in a couple of books that he's done, and you can find it elsewhere on the net. The idea that perhaps scientists someday will be able to seed a universe, that we will be able to create a universe in our lab that will expand, not within our dimensions, it won't expand within our dimensions, but it will expand within its own dimensions. We'll be able to create our own Big Bang in the laboratory. In fact, on that line, Darkmatter did a really interesting and funny video on this that discussed aspects that I won't talk about here, but quite a funny video, one of his cartoon videos, where he talks about how people, there's like a press conference and they're asking all the ludicrous kind of questions that would fit into sort of Abrahamic monotheism and Christianity with respect to that kind of scientist creating a universe in the lab. So what I want to do is to take those two ideas side by side, go through them, give a basic kind of run through as to what they require, and then look at the kind of impact that has perhaps on deism, but also look at the impact that has on various different things, such as fine-tuning arguments, the qualities of God, of what we could expect of a God, all those kinds of things really, and then perhaps draw some conclusions about perhaps whether or not people dismiss deism out of hand simply because they only see the kind of traditional wing of deism. So the first thing to do is just to kind of mush up the simulation argument and the universe creation argument and just see how they both push in the same direction. Okay, so both these two ideas, when you think about it, they both run along broadly similar lines, and the argument that Nick Bostrom made or proposed with the simulation argument applies in many ways in the same way to the idea of seeding a universe in a laboratory, although it's not an argument that's generally made in that context, but it can be made in both contexts. So let's just give a few put a bit of flesh on the bones here in case you're not familiar with the simulation argument especially, and I'm not going to go through all the little curlews that Nick Bostrom goes through to frame his argument in his philosophical context. But let's just go through some of that just to frame it in a way that's relevant to this video. So what it's saying is that there's certain things that you've got to assume in both contexts. In the simulation argument, the first thing you've got to assume, I suppose, is that it's possible to simulate sentient life such as we are. Consciousness, that consciousness can be simulated. And I suppose if you believe, perhaps as a matter of faith, that there's some mystical component to life, then you would believe that it couldn't be simulated, and that would be your get out of that argument. What of course you can't do at this point is to say that, well, no, I don't believe there's a mystical component, but I don't think you could simulate life. You could only create conscious life out of flesh and blood. There's something about the material aspect of life that is critical. And the reason you can't say that is because in a way you're begging the question, because you're assuming that what we see as flesh and blood really is flesh and blood, and isn't the simulation in and of itself as flesh and blood, that this isn't just a sort of phenomenal experience of flesh and blood amongst simulated organisms which we could be ourselves. So you'd be making a bit of a kind of leap of faith there to do that. But if we assume there isn't something mystical and magical that's necessary there, then we could simulate, at least in theory, we could simulate conscious agents. The other thing you need to be able to do is to simulate universes, don't you? You need to be able to simulate a universe that you could populate, either as a direct act of creation with these sentient agents, or allow these sentient agents to evolve within your simulated universe. Of course, we simulate universes all the time. We have all manner of games, whether you play World of Warcraft or the Skyrim game, or all these different games where we're simulating universes, and we're doing it to higher and higher specifications all the time. Of course, what you don't have to do is to simulate the universe that we see out there, or even the universe that we think we see out there, because the universe that you simulate could be very different, and it could have different physical rules to the universe that we live in. Similarly, the universe we live in could have very different rules to the universe that the simulator or simulators, the creators, the deities live in. You also, of course, don't need to have the degree of definition that we think that you need to have. And this is another example of where computers have given us a different perspective on things, because we now know, think of a 3D computer game that you've played. You don't need to simulate the entire simulated universe to the same degree of resolution. The bits that's being observed, it's a little bit like quantum mechanics resolving itself when an interaction takes place. You only need to simulate to the highest degree the bits that's being observed. So if you wanted to simulate the Earth, and to the satisfaction of the simulated earthlings on it, you only need to simulate the bits that they're observing to the highest degree. The dim and distant stars, the dim and distant galaxies, you only need to resolve as and when they understand and appreciate them, and then only to a resolution that they can possibly detect. So you don't need to simulate every single atom and every single galaxy right away across the simulated universe. So that's something that we've learnt via computers, I think. So there are the two things that you need for the simulation argument, really, there, along with a motivation to create simulated universes that would have simulated agents in them, or the ability to evolve simulated agents. Okay, well, we know that we have that because we do it all the time. It's clear that we have that motivation. Definitely clear on that point. Now, with the seeded universe in the laboratory thing, again, you have to accept that there's a possibility that could be done in terms of the physics of it, that you could see the universe, and also that it's possible for the technology to be developed to be able to realize that process. So those are the things that you would have to take, that you would have to accept in advance for that. Now, in either case, then, what you have is this situation, which is the bare bones, the main thrust of Nick Bostrom's simulation argument, which is that if sentient agents such as ourselves could do it, and if we don't blow ourselves up prior to doing it, if that isn't the normal order of things, that sentient agents develop things like nuclear weapons, then blow themselves up before they get any further, if that tends not to be the case generally, then sentient agents such as ourselves will develop to the stage where we would do one of these things, simulate universes or seed universes. And if we could do it, we could do it more than once. And we would want to do it in ways which would perhaps have sentient agents in themselves, because they would be the more interesting ones, wouldn't they? So if we would do that more than once, here's the punchline. The punchline is that the number of simulated universes, this is Bostrom's punchline, the number of simulated universes with sentient agents such as ourselves in would exceed the number of real universes with sentient agents such as ourselves. And that would be the same in the seeded universe as well. The number of seeded universes with sentient agents such as ourselves would exceed the number of real, original universes, you could say, with sentient agents such as ourselves, because for every real universe with sentient agents such as ourselves, they would make more than one. And the ba-dum-dum punchline for Nick Bostrom is that if the number of simulated universes exceed the number of real universes, then by rights, probabilistically speaking, we should exist in a simulated universe, and that's what we should all believe. Badam. Ba-dum-dum-bum-bang. So there's your punchline on that one. So one of the interesting points when people talk about whether the universe could have a creator, because most atheists just rule it off straight away, and yet most atheists are quite scientific in their understanding and would accept, quite happily read somebody like Brian Greene talking about seeded universes and think, yes, that's perhaps a real possibility. It may very well be that in the future we will be able to do that. They might think about simulated universes with real conscious sentient simulated agents within them and think, yeah, that's something we really may be able to do given sufficient technology, perhaps in 1,000 years time or 10,000 years time or whatever. What I would say is you cannot seriously entertain those arguments and those ideas and not seriously also entertain the idea that we could be in one of those simulations or seeded universes ourselves. To accept the former and not accept the possibility of the latter is a real error of judgment, I think. Another interesting point is that often when you talk about the Nick Bostrom-y type thing, is that somebody will come back and say, yes, but who created the original universe, Jim? You haven't explained who created the original universe. And this is where some of these interesting questions come in. One is that in terms of a God, what is a real universe anyway? If you think of a kind of traditional Christian God, one of the traditional Christian sort of understandings of God is that God maintains the universe on an instant-to-instant basis. God maintains and refreshes the universe, that he keeps it all in existence. How is that different from a simulation? What does a computer simulation do? It takes the algorithms and the processes and the laws that govern the simulation and applies that to the present state of the simulation to give the next state of the simulation. So it's doing the same thing. It's constantly, from moment to instant, maintaining and refreshing the simulation from the existent simulation. It's only by that constant process that the simulation continues. So that's pretty much very, very similar to what Christians say that God would be doing. So in what way would the universe that God's created from God's perspective be any more real than it was simulated? So it seems that the lines between what's simulated and what's real is really very, very sketchy right from the get-go, from that kind of perspective. And again, when you look at that God perspective, something that's thrown at you is that you've not solved anything, because all these same problems still amount to this previous universe. You still need your ultimate creator to create the evolved sentient agents that have created our universe. But of course that need not be the case. One of the arguments that's used in favour of a deity creating our universe, of course, is the fine-tuning argument, that when you look at our universe, that when you look at certain constants, they have to have almost the exact value that they have. If they deviated just slightly, the universe would have just flung itself apart before any matter could have coalesced, or would have just collapsed in on itself, perhaps in a fraction of a second. But those fine-tuning arguments may apply to our universe, and may apply to any universe that runs along the same physical laws. But of course the universe in which the simulators exist in, the people that could have simulated our universe, may run along a very different set of laws, and the same fine-tuning arguments which seem so obvious to us that we can see that, and we can work out on our computers that if we tweak this the whole thing falls to pieces, simply might not exist in that different physical framework that other simulated universe existed in. Because of course, if we simulated a universe, we wouldn't have to simulate it with the same physical rules as our own universe. We could create whatever physical laws and rules our imaginations could possibly come up with. And of course, there are many other characteristics and attributes to God that are called into question. In fact, our entire scope of what constitutes a god or a deity is opened up. One of the things is the way in which we think about omnipotence and omniscience and what they must consist of. And this is where I said at the beginning of the video that there's some really interesting ground that you can think of when you start thinking about these ideas of deism. You don't have to accept them, you don't have to believe them, but it's worth thinking about them. And two of them are omniscience and omnipotence itself. What would it mean to be omniscient, and what would it mean to be omnipotent? Imagine if you were running a simulated universe that you'd created, so that you were the god of that universe, or indeed you were one of a team of gods, because from a polytheistic perspective, in fact, what would you class as the god of the universe? The person running the simulation, who may be no cleverer than a spotty school kid running it on his PlayStation 562 10,000 years from now. But what about the person that wrote the program? What about the person that wrote the hardware that the simulation's running on? You've got an old pantheon there of deities, and it's quite interesting to view it in those kinds of lines. Which one of those would you regard as a god of that universe, and which one wouldn't you have done? But the interesting thing is that if the software allows for it, the characteristics that spotty Schoolkid deity possessed could include versions of omniscience and omnipotence. For example, the spotty Schoolkid might not literally know everything in his brain about the simulation, but he may be able to interrogate the simulation so that he can potentially know anything that could be known about that simulation. Similarly, in terms of omnipotence, it may well be that spotty Schoolkid acts from a deistic perspective and never gets involved in the simulation, but he might choose to get involved in the simulation, and with respect to the simulation he could appear and be omnipotent, able to do anything that is logically possible within that simulation. But of course, neither of these two things would make him omnipotent or omniscient in his own realm. In fact, he'd be far from that. He would be a spotty school kid. Okay, so where has all this led? Well, it hasn't really led very far at all. I'm not asking anybody to embrace deism. I haven't embraced deism, and the reason I haven't embraced it is because I'd actually like some positive evidence towards it before I'd embrace any of these ideas. Perhaps if we got to the stage within my lifetime where we could seed universes, perhaps if we got to the stage in my lifetime where we knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that we would be able to simulate universes, then it might push my threshold high enough up to say, do you know what? I think these ideas are more likely than not that we live in a universe seeded by sentient agents or a universe simulated by sentient agents. But we don't know these things for definite, and so I don't put myself in those categories. What I just hope to do is to just give some idea of some of the scope of ideas that could fall under broad brush deism, and just show some of the interesting food for thought that those ideas give in terms of what that means in terms of the characteristics of a god, and what that means in terms of answering some of the questions, such as the fine-tuning question that's often brought forwards. Okay, well, I hope for even those of you that have given this a good coat of thinking about in the past, that there's some aspect of this video that perhaps you'd not thought of before, and that you can end up wasting as much of your life thinking about them as I do. Thank you for listening, and bye for now.